Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. This will be the continuation of Yuuei Survival Guide. This will be Part 27, Chapter 27. Izuku's excited for the summer camp. Oh, the boot camp. He'd been excited for it since Shota had announced it to the class. How could he not be excited for the concept of staying at a forest lodge with his classmates? And his excitement had only flickered briefly when the man had grinned cunningly and announced that it was more training-oriented than he originally let on. Honestly, the word boot camp coming from Shota was pretty scary, especially since they all knew how much of a hard-ass Shota could be during regular heroics classes. Izuku can only imagine what his guardian had planned for them, but the only thing Izuku knows is that he certainly is glad he's not one of the students who failed the physical exam last week. He feels very sorry for Ashido, Kaminari, Kirishima, Sato, and Sero. Sunday sees Izuku packing up a duffel bag with clothes and some of his notebooks and pencils. Notebooks? Oboro, who's flopped on his stomach in Izuku's bed. You're going to camp, man. Why do you need notebooks? 1B's going too, Izuku snorts, lulling his head to glance at the ghost. I'm hoping there'll be some downtime where I can study some of their quirks, and maybe even ask some questions. There are a lot of really cool quirks in their class, and I only got a glimpse of them during the festival. Right. Oboro nods, a smile twitching onto his lips. I forgot you were a quirk nerd. Izuku rolls his eyes. Why do I even talk to you again? Because I'm fun, Oboro pouts, and I'll be a lot more annoying if you don't humor me. My power is festering, Izuku. I could be a god. You can barely pick up a book. Hey, I'm good at books now, and controllers, and I held the Pocky and that glass. You shattered that glass, Izuku reminds, without so much of a glance back at him. But I still held it. Oboro pauses thoughtfully, shifting around so that he's sitting crisscross and can lace his arms over his chest. His lips jut out in a more dramatic pout. Briefly, at least. Izuku snorts a laugh as he moves from his desk to the dresser. He fishes out a couple of changes of clothes and a week's worth before heading to his closet where he tries to figure out what to bring, sweater-wise. Despite it being summer, the forest still gets cold at night, and Izuku knows that his guardians, and the ghost at his side, will be on his case about making sure he's prepared to keep himself warm. He'd already seen Hisashi pack away his heated jacket with the rest of the camping gear that had been on the list that Shota handed out. He doesn't know if he'll be cold enough for that, so he picks out some sweaters. He thinks about grabbing his All Might sweater, but he shakes the thought away. His peers, minus Kachan, don't know the depth of his hero worship, and he'd like to keep it that way as long as he can. It's bad enough they've seen him scribbling away in notebooks and muttering to himself like a weirdo. He doesn't need to go 100% crazy fanboy yet. The blue one's nice. Oboro hums from the bed, watching intently as the teen rifles through his sweaters. The blue one in question was a fairly thin sweater that zipped up. It was good for working out, easy on and off, lightweight but still warm. He pulls it off the hanger and shoves it in the duffel. He pulls out a second sweater, a hoodie that's thick and warm. It'll be good for the evenings. He doesn't know what Shota has planned, but he doubts their evenings will be too exciting. Shota is the one always preaching that they take care of their own needs and rest. He'll push them hard, but he won't overwork them. Anything else that you think I might need? You've seen what happens at these boot camps, right? Oboro pauses, cupping his chin between his thumb and pointer finger thoughtfully. I think that about covers it. Clothes, warm things. You don't gotta worry about food or anything sleeping-wise, I don't think. Shota and Hisashi will probably go through a checklist later because they're worriers, but I think you're good to go. Cool. Izuku hums as he zips up the duffel bag. He moves it from the edge of the bed to the desktop before flopping down beside Oboro. Are you coming with us? Is that a question? Oboro snorts. Of course I am. I'd rather be at camp watching you guys suffer through Sho's training than sitting in Zashi's English class and listening to kids butcher pronunciations. It can't be that bad. Izuku glances to the side where Oboro is shooting him an unamused look. Says the guy who can't pronounce hamburger to save his life. It's just a weird word, Izuku defends with a huff. Sashi said I did pretty good. Half my class can't get it right. There are just too many sounds in it. Zashi's a liar, Oboro teases, scooting to the edge of the bed. He's just a sucker for your determined doe eyes whenever you attempt English words. And I think he just thinks it's too cute to correct outside of class, like when toddlers have lisps and they can't enunciate quite right yet, and parents don't want to stop them just yet, so they don't really correct them. Now Izuku's offended. I'm not a toddler with a lisp. Who needs to know how to say hamburger anyways? English is weird. It's so much easier to say it in Japanese. You're missing a full R in there, Izuku? Oboro laughs, and Izuku's shoulders slump in defeat. And like you guys don't do American-style hamburger night at least once a week due to Hisashi's insistence. You know, he used to bring burgers to school all the time for lunch. What a strange dude. Sho and I just had our bentos, and here's Zashi with a decked-out hamburger. Are you planning on bullying everyone today? Izuku snipes out with a sigh. He's not actually offended. He's very aware English isn't his strongest subject. It's a good thing that he doesn't have big plans to travel to English-speaking countries like All Might. He's not sure he'd survive America. Well, unless he had Hisashi with him. Or All Might, or even Oboro. He seems pretty fluent. Nah, Oboro laughs. I'm done. Sorry, didn't mean to call you out there. It's just really cute, and it's hard to word it. You're right. Trust me. Sashi used to correct us on the daily back in school. We tease him about the hamburger, and then he'd tease us about our pronunciation of hamburger. Oboro snickers to himself like he's reminiscing one exact memory before smiling softly at Izuku. I always knew he'd make a good English teacher. I'd never known anyone as obsessed with American culture. Yeah, that sounds about right. Izuku snorts a laugh as he zips up his duffel bag. The next morning, they're at school very early. Shota has stuff to set up for the trip, so he and Vladking disappear from the teacher's lounge to make sure everything's in order for when they leave. Shota's shoulders are slumped as Vlad talks about the buses and everything they need to have in order before school starts. Each class getting their own. Izuku's not entirely sure why, when he's fairly sure they could all probably fit in one of the bigger Yuuei buses that they had at the ready. He doesn't bother voicing this. Shota and Vlad already obviously have it sorted out. Izuku stays in the office with Hisashi. They're early enough that Izuku's still pretty tired. He'd been in that state of being too excited to shut his eyes and fall asleep, so he's exhausted. He's cuddled up in a put-your-hands-up radio sweatshirt Hisashi had in the teacher's office, and considering he hadn't thought the school would be so chilly, all that warm stuff was packed away in the duffel bag. He just knew it would erupt his stuffed clothes all over the place if he tried to open it even an inch. Izuku sits at Hisashi's side, pressed in close to him as the man types away on his computer. Izuku's cheek smushes against Hisashi's upper arm, body slumped against his guardian. Hisashi's leather jacket is tossed over the back of his chair, and his directional speaker is set off to the side. He doesn't seem bothered in the slightest that Izuku is using his arm like a pillow. He's probably used to it, though. He did marry Shota, after all. He doesn't mean to fall asleep. He hadn't even realized he started leaning to the side until half of his face was smushed comfortably in Hisashi's shirt. Hisashi doesn't mention it either, so Izuku's eyes slip closed as he enjoys the serenity of the teacher's office before the other teachers arrive. Izuku dozes off for maybe an hour, just until other teachers start to show up. It's a bit too early to be waiting in the hallways or in the classroom, but his peers will get suspicious if he's there first. So he'd always been the fourth or fifth to arrive at school when he lived with his mother, and as far as most of his peers and friends know, he still does live with his mother. That said, even if he could sleep a bit longer in the teacher's office until a decent time to announce his arrival, he doesn't. He's not completely comfortable in sleeping in a full room of pros, even though he trusts them all with his life. He sits at Shota's desk, uses the man's computer to work on an essay for Midnight Sensei's class that's not due until the week after the boot camp. Izuku doesn't want to leave it until last minute, even though Midnight is far the most lenient teacher of all of them. Hisashi is a close second, and Shota, well, Shota's dead last. When a reasonable time arrives, Izuku slips off Hisashi's sweatshirt, almost instantly missing the warmth of it, and he pulls on his backpack. He grabs a hold of his duffel bag and ducks his head bashfully as Hisashi stands to pull him into a farewell hug. They'd already briefly done as much earlier, Hisashi hugging him and Shota both. Izuku had ducked his head as Hisashi had pulled Shota into a kiss by squishing the dark-haired man's cheeks. The hug is tight and protective, but soft and comforting. Hisashi gives good hugs, Izuku decides as he buries his cheek in the man's chest. It's a weird thing for him to be hugging someone goodbye. It's another thing that he doesn't remember doing often with his mother. It's only now that he's away from her that he realizes how different his childhood had been to others. For the longest time, he'd only had Kachan's family to go off of. A soft-spoken father who was sweet and caring, and a loud, protective, loving mother who seemed to always be forcing affection onto Kachan. Honestly, it had always stumped Izuku why Auntie was so insistent on hugging Kachan and telling him that she loves him, why she'd ruffle his hair affectionately even when he looked like a rabid dog about to bite her. It was only as Izuku grew up that he started to realize that deep down, his childhood friend loved the affection, even if the scowls and distaste spoke differently. Auntie enforced it, not giving Kachan the chance to puff out his chest and deny the affection at all. He liked it, but didn't want to admit it. Wouldn't ask for it, so she just did it. It was the opposite for Izuku. He craved his mother's attention, her love, After he'd been diagnosed quirkless and had doctor after doctor tell her that he was delusional when it came to his imaginary friends, she'd mentally and physically pulled away from him. He'd always known Kachan's family was drastically different from his own mother, and even his own father, who he barely remembers now. He'd always wished he had someone like Kachan, but he'd never thought this relationship with his mother to be that strange. But he can see it now, that there's something to compare to. Now that he's had people who treat him like Kachan's parents treat him. Hisashi holds him snugly for a moment before pulling back. Without a thought, the man even goes so far as to press a kiss on the top of Izuku's head. The subconscious innocence of it fills his stomach with warmth, a fuzzy feeling. Izuku doesn't think that Hisashi realizes that he'd done it. He just swiftly carries on to ruffle Izuku's curls and attempting to fix them like a fretting parent. "Good luck at camp, sunshine," Hisashi grins. "Take care of yourself and don't let Sho push you around too much. Also, try and make sure he eats something besides those dreaded jelly pouches, you dig? And same goes for you. Real food, Zuku. Don't let him coerce you into eating like a college kid because it's easier, yeah?" "Got it," Izuku mumbles meekly, his cheeks still flushed as he turns over the fact that Hisashi had kissed his head in his mind. He feels small and comfortable, a familiar but so foreign feeling. "See you later, Hisashi." Hisashi's grin widens as he lets out a cooing noise, hugging Izuku again. Well, squeezing him tightly to the point Izuku can hardly breathe before easing his strength a little. "It'll be so quiet without you two around," the man pouts theatrically. "I'll just miss you loads. Be careful, you hear? Watch your temperature. Tell Sho if you get too cold. You've got the heated jacket for a reason. Use it, yeah?" Izuku bobs his head in a nod as his cheeks darken. Midnight, who's across the room, snickers into her hand, and Izuku wants to flee immediately. Who knew Hisashi was such a mother hen? "Come on, Zashi. Leave the kid alone." Midnight scoffs, coming to his defense. She flashes Izuku a teasing smile and a wink, an aunt sort of air to her as she reclines back in the office chair. "I'm sure he's well aware of all this. I don't doubt that you and Sho already gave him a lecture once or twice, or 100 times, and you're forgetting the biggest worrywart of all of them is going to be with him. Shoto will watch out for the little green bean like a hawk." "But it's like sending my baby off to kindergarten for the first time," Hisashi cries out, squeezing Izuku just a little bit tighter. Izuku feels his cheeks flare in embarrassment, but he doesn't try to pull away. It's obvious that the three of them are a little shaken after the mall incident still, even if things have calmed down at this point. Plus, he'd heard some of his friends mentioning their own parents having hesitance to let them go after all the fuss with the League of Villains being stirred up between the USJ, Hosu, and the most recent mall incident, where they'd all been in the same building as the leader of the villain organization as well, even if none of them besides Izuku had really been in direct danger. Not that he's saying Hisashi and Shota are his parents. They're guardians. This is just an arrangement of convenience. They're not his parents. They're just really amazing teachers and pro-heroes who are looking out for him, right? Right. "Your husband is literally his teacher," Emery deadpans. "And that's no baby, babe. That's a full-ass teenager. He's fine, right, kiddo? He'll be fine." "It's just boot camp," Izuku agrees with a tiny, disarming smile. "What can possibly happen?" "You're right," Hisashi pouts, finally releasing the teen. "I just hate that this camp is so secretive. I mean, none of us know where it'll be. I know it's the same thing every year, but this year it feels different. I mean, with everything that's already happened, I'm sure a lot of us are already on edge." "It'll be fine." Shota's voice rings from the doorway. His shoulders are slumped as he treks casually into the room, pausing at Izuku's side where he observes the situation over his nose. "I'll be there. And Vlad'll be there. I can handle my hell class, and I hope to God he can handle his." "That's almost one of the nicest things you've ever said to me, Aizawa," Vladiking drawls from beside him, arms crossed over his chest. "For the record, I can handle my class perfectly fine. It's the superior heroics class, after all. Powerful, responsible, respectful. Can you say the same, Eraser?" Shota waves him off tiredly. "Like I said, it'll be fine." Shota pauses, gaze dropping to Izuku. "You should head out. I've seen some of your classmates in the halls, and I know you don't want to be caught sneaking out of the teacher's office when the halls are crowded." "Right," Izuku bows anxiously. Goodbye," the boy announces to the room before he can even think better of it. He's half aware of the fact that majority of his teachers are in the room at this point. Some chuckle, others, Namuri, wave at him with fond looks. Hisashi looks like he's refraining from catching Izuku in a third hug, and Shota looks indifferent, which he probably is, considering he'll be with Izuku and the rest of 1A on the trip. "Stay safe, sunshine," Hisashi hollers as Izuku flees the room. He offers a wave over his shoulder as the door slips shut behind him. He only lets out a breath of relief when he's a couple steps away from the office door. That was embarrassing to watch. Oboro joins Izuku at his side, and the teen has absolutely no idea where the ghost had been watching from. Last Izuku had seen him, Oboro was following Shota out to make sure everything was in order. I'd rather watch Sho be boring but potentially eavesdrop on his plans for you and the class than to watch you drool on Zashi as you sleep while he stares at his computer like a zombie. Oboro had scoffed with a playful smile, rushing out the door after Shota and Vlad. Izuku couldn't argue with that, well, most of it. I do not drool, he'd wanted to huff out, and had to physically bite his own tongue to keep the words in. He blatantly ignores the ghost now, who wilts when he realizes, but falls into step with Izuku nonetheless. I was just kidding. You left the room like an expert. Honest, Izuku, come on. Most of the class had already gathered in the 1A class by the time that Izuku arrives. Uraraka rushes up to him, Ida not far behind her. Even Todoroki casually settles at Izuku's side, eyes shifting suspiciously around the room for whatever reason. Oboro glares at the half-hot, half-cold classmate as if just being in both of their presences will make Izuku drop into hypothermic state. It will not. It's not long before the rest of the class trickles in, and then the bell rings. They're all in their seats, bags and luggage propped up on their desktops at their feet. The door rolls open sharply 1 second after the bell, and Shota's stalking into the room, looking more tired than he had when Izuku had last seen him. I hope you're all ready for camp, the man drawls out, gesturing them up with a lazy wave of his hand. It's a long drive. You have 10 minutes to do as you please. There'll not be a lot of rest stops, so take that into account. I expect to see you all at the bus loading zone not a second later than these allotted 10 minutes. We can and will leave you. Consider this a lesson of punctuality. The man pauses, eyeing them lazily as he digs his hands into his pockets and slumps even further. 9 minutes and 54 seconds. The class all jump to collect their belongings as Shota stalks out of the room, leaving them with the threat hanging over their heads. Ida herds them along with authoritative words and chopping motions of his hand like he always does, even if they've already been terrified of both the time limit ticking down fast and the thought of being left behind. Izuku's panicked eyes catch a boring look of Oboro, who glances over as if he's feeling his gaze. The ghost scans him before shrugging. Yeah, that's not a logical ruse. He definitely will leave without you, if you're not there in time. It happened before, a few years back. That spurs Izuku on. The bathrooms are a mess, but Izuku manages to sneak into one of the stalls to pee before hurrying out to the bus that's loading up. He's one of the first, the other three being Yaoyorozu, Koda, and Todoroki. Shota leans back against the bus doors as if guarding it, eyes slivering open at noise of another student arriving before he shuts them again with a hardly noticeable upward twitch of his lips. The minutes fly by, and before they even hit 8 minutes, the class is lined up and waiting. Shota doesn't move for nearly a full couple of minutes before he finally lets out a sigh and steps away. The doors to the bus open, and he gestures to the cargo compartments under the bus. Belongings in here, and onto the bus. Boot camp is a lot more intense than Izuku had assumed it was going to be. He hadn't expected things to start right off the bus. Who makes students traverse through the wilderness for over 8 hours in an attempt to find a lodge in the middle of nowhere? Oboro laughs the whole time, loud and annoying as he follows behind Izuku. They arrive battered and exhausted, having missed the lunch that Shota and the Pussycats had waved in front of their faces before they were thrown into the forest. It's not all bad, Izuku supposes. They get a nice meal and hang out in the hot springs to relax before heading to bed. He meets Koda, even if the boy doesn't seem to particularly like Izuku, or, well, any of them. Oboro absolutely cackles when the small 5-year-old sucker punches Izuku right in the crotch, and things hadn't gotten much easier after that. The training's hard, but Izuku loves every minute of it. He works hard, and when there's a lapse in his own training, he watches what Class B can do. He knows very little about their quirks, and only what he can remember from seeing the sports festival. As exhausting as it is, Izuku's glad to be here. It's fun, in a sense, hanging out with his class, sitting in the hot springs together, cooking and eating together. Hanging out as a whole, it's different from the mall adventure, since no one has anywhere to be. And it's the third night that shit hits the fan. It's all a mess, really. Villains attacking the camp, and the only thing Izuku can think of is that the fact that Koda's not there. Koda is just a little kid. He's alone and defenseless, and the villains are ruthless. If they want to take out the kid, they will. The thought makes Izuku sick. He takes off with Oboro on his tail, the ghost sprinting after him and shouting questions that Izuku can't think straight enough to answer. He has one thing on his mind, and that's finding Koda and bringing him to safety. He knows exactly where Koda is. He'd brought the boy curry that evening before. Wasn't hard to follow Kota's footprints yesterday, a well-used trail with small little footsteps that lead to a cliffside clearing, to the boy's secret base. His steps falter and his breath gets trapped in his lungs as a dark thought catches in his mind. If I managed to follow his footsteps to this location, who else could have? The thought in itself has Izuku's heart sinking into his stomach as he pushes himself to move faster. He's never been gladder for Shota to make him do suicide sprints as a punishment. It really helped with his speed and stamina. Oh my god, Oboro wheezes out as they're finally trekking up the cliffside. Izuku's pace hadn't slowed at all, but Oboro still beats him up there. The ghost freezes, faltering before he's whipping his head to look at Izuku. Kota's not alone, Izu. You really need to get up here. Izuku's teeth clench, biting the inside of his cheek to the point of drawing blood. A metallic tang washes over his tongue as he forces his tired legs and his heaving lungs to work harder, to get there faster. It's no more than a second or two before Izuku is stumbling to join Oboro at his side, the ghost staring wide-eyed at Kota, who's shaking and curled in on himself under a towering man's gaze. The man takes slow, threatening steps towards the boy, and it seems like he's amused when Kota's head flinches back in fear. It feels like Izuku blinks, and suddenly he's between Kota and the villain. Oboro is right by Kota's side, down on one knee and assessing him without getting too close, while Izuku's body acts as a human shield. He'd seen the fearful tears in Kota's eyes, and prays that it's just fear and not pain making him cry out. He's not hurt, Oboro breathes out after what feels like minutes, but can only really be a second. Izuku feels a small weight drop off his shoulders at the information. The bigger part of him is gearing up for a fight, as the villain in front of him is tearing off his cloak. The first attack sends Izuku crashing into the rocky cliff behind him. He sucks in a breath of pain, and he half hears Oboro's panicked voice calling his name through the static ringing in his ears. Nothing feels broken yet, but it hurts. His arm aches, and it feels heavy at his side. Whoops, the villain teases. Oh yeah, hey, you wouldn't happen to know where I can find a kid named Bakugo, would you? Izuku's body freezes, as if Oboro had just stepped through him, as the words register, Bakugo. They were looking for Kacchan? What? What does the League want with Kacchan? The villain's smile curls cruelly as he launches at Izuku with a heavy-handed punch. I still have a job to do, after all. And Izuku hardly manages to dodge the punch that's coming right at him, rocks and dirt raining down on him as the punch makes contact with the cliffside. Izuku swallows at the sheer force of it. I'll take your silence to mean that you don't know, and is that right? The villain sneers through a twisted smile. Oh, good, then. Izuku doesn't even manage to get his feet under him when the villain kicks him in the stomach, sending him flying into the air. He wheezes as he flies, tasting blood but not knowing exactly where it's coming from. Izuku! Oboro cries out as Izuku's back collides with the stone cliff again, falling lifelessly to the ground. The ghost is at his side the second that he flops down. Oh my god, who the hell is this guy? Izuku can just shake his head as the ghost's hand wavers at his side. Not yet, Izuku manages out when Oboro goes to touch him, to use their quirks. Try and distract him. Last resort, please. Oboro's face pinches in disbelief, annoyance flickering in his eyes as he pushes himself up. I can help. Why won't you let me? Izuku hears the snarl in Oboro's voice, the confusion that's overcome by frustration. It only softens when Oboro follows Izuku's gaze to Kota, still on his knees with tears streaming down his face. Okay. The ghost finally breathes out, not looking pleased. Fine. I'll try and distract him while you fight back. Don't die. Just tell me when to help. Izuku gives a light nod as he pushes himself up, the villain sauntering threateningly towards him. It takes a second, too long for Izuku to realize that the villain had been talking the whole time, taunting and teasing. Izuku feels blood on his face, but once again not sure where it's coming from. A head wound, splattered from somewhere else. He knows he can't be worried about Kacchan now. This villain is strong. He has Izuku beat in offense and defense. If he isn't focused, he'll die. If he doesn't focus, Kota will die. That can't happen. No one will die, not if he has anything to say about it. Izuku charges forwards, one for all lighting up his veins. He throws a punch that lands on the villain's muscular forearm. But nothing happens. The villain doesn't budge. One for all did nothing against him. What the hell? What the hell? Oboro parrots dumbly from behind the villain as if hearing Izuku's own thoughts. Izuku peeks over at the ghost, whose mouth is dropped open in shock, wide eyes glaring at where Izuku's fist is cushioned in bulging muscles. He's tossed to the side, like he's a weightless doll, as the villain rambles on about his quirk. Muscle regeneration, enhanced speed and strength. Izuku forces himself to his feet as the villain stalks closer, only just managing to keep back when the villain manages to punch at him. The force of the punch sends Izuku into the air, and then the villain appears through the rubble and sends him sprawled onto the floor. Izuku feels tired, his muscles tense in an attempt to get up, but he can't seem to force himself to. Oh shit, oh shit, Oboro hisses as he puts himself between the teen and the villain. There's not a lot he can do without Izuku's quirk. You've got to get through me first, Muscles, the ghost snarls. I'm sorry, Izuku, I gotta use my quirk. You're not dying here. Oboro's stance takes a defensive position as the ghost steps closer and closer. Every step the villain takes, Oboro takes one back. Izuku knows as soon as he's within range to make contact, he will. Truthfully, Izuku doesn't know how the cloud will help them right now. A cliffside is a dangerous place to lose the ability to navigate. One wrong step and you could fall off the edge. If Oboro makes a dense cloud to confuse the villain, who's to say it won't confuse Koto or even Izuku as well? And this isn't the kind of villain you can just run from. If Oboro were to carry them out on a cloud, the villain would follow, or worse, make his way to Izuku's unsuspecting teachers and classmates. Izuku pulls himself up, faintly on wobbly limbs. He sucks in a breath. I'm okay, he manages out. Hardly audible, but Oboro seems to hear it if the momentary tensing of his body is anything to go by. The ghost twitches like he's physically stopped himself from glancing back at Izuku and instead keeps his attention locked on the incoming threat. How are you going to save him, huh? The villain's smile only grows wider, darker as he continues forwards. You're no hero. You're just a fraud, and you'll die that way. Oboro is just before Izuku, hand reaching back and ready to make contact when the villain freezes, turning slowly to glance behind him. Oboro looks confused, but Izuku can just suck in a breath. Shit. Izuku can hardly push himself up as Koto yells about his parents' water hose. He remembers seeing it in the news, and Izuku thinks back to just recently, where he'd gotten the details from Mandalay. How Koto was staying with his aunt and the Pussycats after being orphaned by a villain. This villain is the one to do that? He killed Koto's parents. He orphaned a little boy simply because he wanted to kill people? A newfound anger rages through Izuku as he finally finds his bearings and launches himself up. Oboro watches in shock as Izuku launches himself overhead. He remembers shouting in anger, but that doesn't mean he exactly remembers what he'd said. He's so mad, and he's hurting for Koto. Emotions don't belong in the battlefield, but he can't help it. The villain catches Izuku's surprise attack, catching his fist in a layer of muscle, but that's exactly what Izuku wants. It's not a matter of whether or not I can do it, Izuku snarls out, one for all flickering through his body. A hero's job is to risk his life and turn his promises into a reality. And Izuku lands a 100% punch of one for all, right into the villain's face. Izuku struggles to keep his footing as the ground rumbles in an explosion from the force of the villain being sent flying into the cliff. It fills Izuku with a sick sense of satisfaction. Finally, he manages to send the villain flying instead of the other way around. Shit! Izuku forces his attention to Oboro, who's running towards where Koto had been knocked off his feet and is tumbling forwards. Izuku moves the fastest he ever has, remembered moving, sliding painfully on his chest and stomach as he just manages to grab the back of Koto's shirt between his teeth. That was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen, Oboro gasps, kneeling beside Izuku. And I'm dead. Izuku snorts a laugh out of his nose as he mumbles a quiet apology to Koto without losing his grip on the boy's clothes. Izuku sees Oboro reaching down to Koto almost subconsciously. Sometimes Izuku forgets that Oboro is a hero too, and a hero's first response is always to help. He shakes his head, expecting the ghost to just phase through the boy, but to his genuine surprise, Oboro's hands actually catch on the boy's shirt. Oboro freezes, gaze dropping to where his knee is pressed against Izuku's side. He doesn't dwell on it, not when Izuku's holding a child up from falling off of a cliff with nothing but his teeth. The ghost grabs a better grip on the fabric of the child's shirt and helps Izuku heft the boy up. Izuku darts a grateful set of eyes in Oboro's direction. The ghost just manages a half-smile through his own shock. The ghost pulls himself away when Koto is safely on the ground, small chest heaving with panicked, adrenaline-filled breaths as he stares down the cliff that he'd almost fallen off. Oboro's quiet for a second, thoughtful as he looks between Izuku and Koto. I just touched the kid. Izuku eyes the ghost with tired, pained eyes before he bows his head in an exhausted nod. He wants to say more, but his attention is drawn to where Koto is scrambling back away from the edge, scared eyes on Izuku, but not really looking at him. Who was that? The boy gasps out, watery eyes darting around them like he's searching out a second person. Something grabbed my shirt and pulled me up. Izuku glances at Oboro, who frowns. Kota had felt it too. That's new. No one else was here, Izuku tells the boy softly, pushing himself up as well. He's so tired. His arm definitely broken now, and he's still bleeding, but he manages to push himself to his feet. Oboro's at his side, hands hovering like he's afraid that Izuku will topple over. Are you all right? Kota's eyes scan their surroundings once again before he gives a slight nod and he turns back to look at Izuku. Thank you for... The words die in Kota's throat, but Izuku's too busy surveying around them to gauge the villain's status and really question the pause. Izuku swallows. We should get back to camp. It's not far. The rocks shift behind him, and Izuku whips around to see the villain stepping out of the crater that he'd created. When hitting the rocks, his muscle regenerates, and Izuku can just stare. Suddenly at his side, Oboro is muttering shocked profanities, and Kota scuffles back away from the threat. It's not over yet. Izuku's not sure how this villain is back up, how he's stronger than before. The villain had just been toying with him until he could kill him. Now he was using his full power, full potential. Izuku barely managed to jump away with Kota, Oboro on his heels as the villain strikes where they'd been standing. He can barely think straight, but he knows he needs a plan. He needs Shota. His guardian could erase this guy's quirk, but Shota's not here, and he can not very well lead the villain to the camp. Not only is that dangerous for the students and people there, especially if Shota's not there, but he's not even sure he'd be fast enough to do it. What you thinking here, Zuku? Oboro asks at his side, matching Izuku's steps. The only thing he can think of doing is using One for All, 100% again. He can't just stand here. He's not fast enough to lead Muscular along. He's stuck, and the only thing that matters is keeping Kota safe. He tells the boy to run, ignores the way Oboro's face pinches with worry as Izuku charges at the villain, veins lighting up with One for All. He tries. He really, really does, but it's no use. This villain is strong, and he's so tired, and One for All isn't enough. There's really no denying it, as Izuku is pressed back and then down into the ground, Muscular using all his force to grind him into the ground like he's scuffing out the butt of a cigarette. He's going to die. Izuku! Izuku hears Oboro's voice. He's tired, though. He hurts so much. The villain's on him, and it feels like he's dying. He's being ground into rocks, and it hurts. God, he can't die in front of a kid. Not in front of a ghost. Izuku's thoughts shift to his teachers. A desperate jump like he's trying to comfort himself before he dies. Shota and Hisashi, his guardians. He never got to thank them for everything they've done for him. He won't get to thank them. He hopes they know. He hopes they know how thankful he is, how much he cares about them. Izuku winces as his thoughts slowly dissipate, body feeling so heavy. He's tired. He just wants to shut his eyes. Izuku barely feels a hand on his arm, fingertips brushing over his skin, and then all he sees is white. For a moment he thinks that he'd finally kicked the bucket, and that this was the light everyone always talked about when they survive a near-death experience. He'd never been convinced it was a thing, but here he is now, facing it head-on. He didn't expect the afterlife to hurt as much as it did. Shouldn't the pain be gone? Izuku chokes on a breath as he squeezes his eyes shut, accepting his fate. What the fuck? Muscular rumbles, distracted. Where the hell did this shit come from? Izuku forces his eyes open as something drips onto him. Water? Maybe. He's not sure. He sees the blank whiteness in front of his eyes and, wait, that's not a light. That's a dense fog in front of him. So dense that he can hardly even make out the villain's face when they're so close. Oboro is solid at his side, hand clamped around Izuku's wrist. He'd pulled himself into the same position, squashed under the towering heavy villain, trapped. The ghost's teeth are clenched like he's in pain, and Izuku's heart breaks at the sight. Oboro. I ain't letting you kick it so soon, Zuku. Oboro grunts out, his face is pinched in pain as Muscular's elbow grinds down into his chest. Most of his force is on Izuku, but with where Oboro turns solid, he's also trapped under a massive regenerating and bulging muscles. Izuku doesn't know why he doesn't just let go. Why he's forcing himself to suffer with Izuku so that he can just pull away from Izuku and he'll be massless again. He doesn't have to do it. He doesn't have to. Izuku opens his mouth to say as much, but he can't seem to voice it when his gaze catches with his friend's. Oboro's head turns faintly to face Izuku, lips twitching up into a pained half-smile. You didn't think I'd let you go, did you? We're in this together, Zuku. Besides, we're only just getting to know each other. If you die now, I'll track your ass through the afterlife so I can kick it back to life. Oberon's words are a snarl, but Izuku hears the underlying hysteria. The fear. The answer to his own question catches Izuku off guard when he finally stumbles onto it. No, when he falls head first into it. He feels like an idiot for not realizing instantly. Oberon's a hero. Always has been and always will be. They're in this together. And Izuku tries to return the smile, but he doubts it happens, and if it does, he's sure it's more of a grimace. A splash of water dribbles onto Izuku, shocking his system and dragging him from his thoughts. He hardly has a second to hazily question where water came from when he hears Koda's voice. He hears the desperation. He hears the plea. The fierce determination thundering over fear, the makings of a hero. The water. Koda's quirk. Water hose. A water-based quirk just like his parents. Koda. Oboro. He can't die now. There are people he needs to protect. People he needs to survive for. Use us, Ninth. We're here. The voice is whispered into the depth of his mind. So small, but booming as if he'd been screamed at. Calm and familiar, penetrating his mind. First. That's first voice. He hadn't heard it all from the vestiges since he'd been in the hospital with One for All. More voices clutter his head, and he can hardly hear his own thoughts over it. They're encouraging, determined. He feels One for All without actually activating it. He feels the power, strong and unrelenting, despite his battered body, despite how defeated he feels, and his own wavering exhaustion. The power buzzing feels like more. There's simply no way to describe it. He's never felt it like this. He's felt 100%, and this has surpassed it. This is so much. It's like he feels all of them buzzing through the quirk. All 7 of the past users, of the vestiges trapped in the quirk, using their own full ability, lighting the quirk up simultaneously with everything they know and have learned about the quirk. Several powerful quirk users putting everything into it, pushing the limits. The raw power coursing through his veins spurs him on. This isn't One for All 100%. This is One for All 1,000,000%. Shota had not been expecting to run into a bruised and battered Izuku. Honestly, he's sure the image will be haunting his dreams for the remainder of his life. His kid rushing up to him with Koda on his back, the child's eyes wide and traumatized. Izuku's limbs are broken, and he's muttering so fast that Shota can barely piece it all together. Shota's surprised the teen is still standing, let alone ready to charge into the next fight. It's obvious Izuku had an agenda, spouting information and telling him his plans, but it was equally obvious that he was running on adrenaline. And then the kid had the nerve to try and leave. It takes one word from Shota for the kid to freeze, stumbling to a stop instead of jumping into a sprint like he'd been prepared to do. Deep down, Shota knew there was no stopping his kid when he had his mind set on something. Izuku was a spitfire and a force to be reckoned with. And Shota can see the adrenaline flickering in the green-haired boy's eyes. It won't be long until it's wavering and he's overcome by exhaustion and pain. It really is against his better judgment to send his student off again, especially in his state. But he had Koda to be worried about too, and Izuku is a hero course student. He's a fine pupil, and Shota trusts his ability. Still, it doesn't make his heart ache any less when he watches his injured foster child sprint off in the other direction, heading towards the heart of the attack instead of away from it. He feels a little better after hearing Izuku give his message off to Mandalay, his permission for them to use their quirks. It's all he can do with the forest infested with villains and only 6 pros. They need to be able to protect themselves and each other without worrying about repercussions in the future. He'll deal with the heat of that when it inevitably comes. Now he just wants them to survive. They've been training for this. He won't say they're ready for it. No one ever really is ready to face something like this, but he will say that he's damn proud of their progress in only a few short months. If any of his classes are prepared for this, it's 1A. It's only after Izuku's out of his sight that Shota realizes he forgot to tell the boy to return after passing along his message. He's not stupid enough to assume that Izuku will let his injuries get the better of him. He knows that child will keep going until he can't hold himself up. The thought alone scares him. "Mister," Shota blinks, reminded of the child that he's clutching to his chest. Koda hadn't spoken thus far. He'd been pretty shocked, had hardly looked at Shota in the eyes, and he'd been handed off. It was to be expected, and Shota really hadn't expected the child to say anything. He's only 5 years old, and he'd just been witness to a brutal villain attack. He'd witnessed Izuku fighting within the brink of his own life in order to protect him. Shota lets out a gruff hum in response. "Is he going to be okay?" Shota turns his head to glance down at the boy without stopping his movements. The sooner he gets Kota to safety, the sooner he can get back out of there and aid. The question catches him off guard, and Kota squeezes around his neck tighter. I wasn't very nice to him, and he still got beat to a pulp just to protect me. I never got to apologize or even thank him. Please tell me he's not going to get hurt more. Shota turns the question over in his head a couple of times before blowing out a breath and ducking his head in a light nod. Don't worry, Shota finds himself saying, and he wishes he could find comfort in his own words. He sustained those injuries because he has no intention of dying. The child curls in closer, and Shota feels tears soaking into his capture weapon. You'll get your chance to thank him, Shota tells the child, and he prays it to be the truth. It's quiet for a few seconds. The only thing to be heard is Shota's own heavy breaths as he runs, and Kota's light sniffles. Shota's sure that Mandalay will have her hands full with Kota for a while after this. First his parents and now a villain attack so close to his own home. Mister, there was something else. The boy's breath fans across the strip of skin not protected by his capture weapon. Shota keeps running as the child pauses. There was someone else there, at my base with us. Shota's mind slams to a halt, but he keeps moving. Keeps running. He has to get this child to safety, and then he has to be there for his kids. He can only pray the rest of the class comes out of this better than Izuku had. He shouldn't have let him go alone. Another villain? Shota manages to force out. The thought of Izuku being in a 2-against-1 fight, one of the villains being the behemoth who Izuku reported regenerating his muscle mass and being nearly undefeatable. Due to it, it makes his heart quicken in his chest. He feels the kid shake his head against his collarbone, and he's not even sure if the boy is actually shaking his head or using his jumpsuit to dry his tears. Shota can't be bothered to care either way. He'd had worse on his hero costume than tears and snot. I don't know, the boy whimpers out. I don't think so. Shota almost trips over his own feet at the admission. He catches himself smoothly and keeps going, angling his chin down to show the boy that he has his attention. Someone else who's not a villain. I heard Deku talking to him, I think, but no one else was there. And then I heard someone else. Someone who wasn't a villain, or Deku. Deku and him were talking, but I couldn't really hear them. He was just... Kota swallows, tucking his face closer to Shota's neck. There, with Deku, under the villain, I think. Shota doesn't know why the thought that someone else was there with his kid prickles at his skin. Who'd have been there? It couldn't possibly be one of the students. He knows for certain that none of them would have left Izuku in that state. Besides, Kota had seen all of the students at this point. He'd have been able to tell. The question is, why hadn't Izuku reported this same piece of information when he passed off Kota? Where is this person right now, Kota? Did he leave you and Deku after the fight? I don't know. Shota hears the tears in the boy's voice. I didn't even see him. I didn't even know he was actually there. Deku said he didn't see him, but he helped us. He was a good guy. Then he was gone, and Deku didn't remember him. Didn't remember him? Shota prompts breathily. Did Izuku have some sort of head injury? There had been a lot of blood on his foster kid, but he seemed all right. Looking past the obvious wear and tear from using his overused and overpowered quirk, at least. Or was Kota imagining things? It's not unheard of for children in traumatic situations to hallucinate things. He's read case studies of children hearing or seeing things that aren't actually there. Overactive imaginations. Fear responses. Doesn't make sense. To hear someone who's not there. Someone Izuku doesn't recall. To hear someone but not see them. He helped us, Kota wails out instead of an answer, and all Shota can do is hug the boy tighter as he runs. He was like a guardian angel. Just there when we needed him, but he was there. I know he was. I heard him. He protected us. He and Deku protected me. Shota huffs out a breath, patting the boy's back where he's holding him. Guardian angel. A childlike sentiment. It's starting to sound more like Kota put someone there instead of someone being there. He's only a child after all. He shouldn't have been in this situation in the first place. None of them should have. They're all just kids. Kota, his students, 1B. Shota feels silly for even thinking someone could have been there with them. Izuku would have reported another person to him if something had actually happened like that. If someone had been there. As much as he trusts the word of Kota, the boy is probably in shock, and he knows the child is in shock, actually. Rightfully so. Right now he can't be thinking about whether or not there was someone else in that fight with Izuku. All that matters is that both Izuku and Kota made it out of there alive. They're alive, and if that's because of some guardian angel Shota can't say he really believes in a logical thought, really, then so be it. Kota hides his wet face in Shota's shoulder, and the man lets the conversation fall at that. When Izuku joins up with his peers, the one with the sentient quirk and the one that can duplicate his own limbs, Oboro can finally let out a breath of relief. As much as he hates the fact that Izuku is with other living people, he tends to be put on the back burner and ignored. He can't say he's not relieved when there are others who can help him. Oboro tries, but without Izuku himself, Oboro is as good as useless. Shoji has Izuku off his feet, protected on his back. It's clear Izuku's attention is elsewhere now. He's got a goal of getting to Bakugo, and he makes it happen. Oboro can just follow along and observe, wait and be ready for if he's needed. He doubts Izuku will call on him, not when he's surrounded by his peers, but he's ready if it happens. Soon they find Bakugo and Todoroki, and a while later Uraraka and the girl with the frog quirk. Oboro can only watch as the classmates fight to make it back to camp, back to safety. He knows better than to talk to Izuku than to distract him right now, so he stays quiet. He watches from the background. He's glad Izuku has friends that he can put his trust in. It makes Oboro miss Shota and Hizashi. When that guy in the trench coat takes Tokiyami and Bakugo, all hell breaks loose. Oboro doesn't tend to float often. It's not something he likes to do. He likes to pretend to be as alive as he can be, and floating, weightlessly without mass, is very not alive sort of thing to do. Air travel only really works for him if it's on one of his clouds. But now, in the heat of everything, he doesn't even think about it when he launches himself after Shoji, Izuku, and Todoroki, when they fling themselves into the air using zero gravity and Asui's tongue. He just goes with them. He won't leave Izuku alone. He refuses. Oboro stays close to his friend through the chaos of the villains when the warp gate opens and dread pulls in Oboro's stomach. God, could this get any worse? Oboro decides he really doesn't like the villain in the trench coat when he lets up his illusion and the marbles that Shoji has turn out to be ice. The asshole still has the students, damn it. His heart thrums in his chest when Bakugo's revealed, caught in the blue-fired quirk man's hand. Izuku screams for his friend, launching towards him despite his injuries. Oboro is on Izuku's heels as the broken boy rushes forward, the closing warp gate in an attempt to grab Bakugo. It's closing so fast. Izuku leaps right before it closes. A hand darts out from the purple void, and 4 fingers grasp around the boy's wrist. Those same fingers, that same hand that haunts Oboro's mind every time he shuts his eyes. The hand that had closed around the boy's neck at the mall, threatening to decay him. No! Oboro pushes forward, reaching out for his friend. Well, 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 that gravelly voice calls. But the decaying face doesn't surface itself. The portal is closing fast, and Izuku is tugged in just as it closes. Looks like this level rewarded me greatly. Target acquired, and a little gift for me for playing as well. Level complete. Oboro sees Izuku's wide eyes, face twisted in pain as he's tugged roughly through the remaining tiny opening of the portal. Izuku! Oboro screams out, his hand reaching out to grab the boy. No, no, no! The ghost reaches his hand out. He launches to grab the boy, throw himself at the void. He has to grab him. He has to. Oboro's so close to the black and purple swirling void that he's so close to being there, so close to grabbing Izuku or stepping through to be with him. He has to make it. The portal closes, and Oboro hits the ground harder than he even thought that he could as a ghost with no body. He drags himself to his hands and knees just as fast as he'd hit the ground, gaze darting around to spot any sign of that portal. But he doesn't see anything. Not so much as a granule. He's gone. The villains have Izuku, and Oboro hadn't stopped it. Fuck! All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 27 of Yuuei Survival Guide. Chapter 28 will be next. Hope you guys are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.